What if I told you that there's a plant growing along your fence line right now that people have been dropping into hot water on this continent for over 300 years, and that most of us have never once thought of it as anything but something to run over with a mower? I'm standing at the edge of a gravel driveway in the Appalachian foothills of East Tennessee. It's the end of July. The spring wildflowers finished weeks ago. The summer heat has flattened most of the lawn, and yet right here, in this thin strip of packed dirt where the gravel meets the grass, there is a stand of small white flowers about knee-high that has been blooming steadily since May and has no intention of stopping. Almost everybody who has walked past this spot has assumed these are weeds. Some of them have probably assumed they're baby daisies. A few might have guessed chamomile. They're none of those things. This is fleabane, and once you understand what you're actually looking at, I don't think you'll ever mow over it the same way again. Hi, this is Tom Harper, and welcome back. Today, I want to take you through one of the most disrespected native wildflowers in North America. And I want to do it properly, because this plant deserves better than the reputation it's got. I'm going to show you exactly how to identify it in your own yard, down to the one feature that separates it from every daisy-looking thing growing near it. I'm going to tell you where that strange name came from, and why it's based on a belief that turned out to be completely wrong. I'm going to show you the period in American history when this so-called weed had an official entry in the National Drug Book, distilled and bottled and sold in pharmacies. And at the end, I'm going to show you how people traditionally made a tea from it, what it actually tastes like, and just as importantly, who should leave it alone entirely. So let's get down close and look at it. The first thing to understand is that fleabane isn't one plant. It's a whole genus called Erigeron, and it sits in the aster family, the same enormous family that gives us sunflowers, asters, goldenrod, and dandelions. Worldwide, there are hundreds of species in this genus. Across North America, there are well over 100 native ones, and depending on where you're standing, you've probably got two or three of them within walking distance. The ones most people meet are eastern daisy fleabane, Erigeron annuus, which is the tall branching one I'm standing next to here. Then there's Philadelphia fleabane, Erigeron philadelphicus, which tends to bloom earlier in the spring. There's prairie fleabane, Erigeron strigosus, which likes drier, rockier ground. And then there's the odd cousin of the group, Erigeron canadensis, which most people know as horseweed or Canada fleabane, and which we'll come back to later, because that one has a story all its own. Now let's identify what's in front of me. Start at the ground and work up. The stems are upright, branching toward the top, and they are noticeably hairy. Run your fingers up one and you can feel it. It's a bristly texture, with the hairs standing out from the stem, rather than lying flat. The leaves alternate up the stem. They're roughly lance-shaped, and the lower ones have coarse teeth along the edges. They're hairy, too, which matters, because that fuzz is the reason most people who try eating the older leaves raw only try it once. This plant is about 2.5 feet tall, though the species ranges from 1 foot to 3.5, depending on soil and sun. Now the flowers, and this is where you get your certainty. Each flower head is small, roughly half an inch across. There's a bright yellow center and a ring of white petals, sometimes with a faint pink or lavender blush on the undersides. So far, that describes a daisy. Here's the difference. Look at how many petals there are, and look at how narrow they are. On a fleabane, those white rays are thread-like, packed shoulder to shoulder, and there are anywhere from 40 to well over 100 of them on a single head. On some Philadelphia fleabane heads, you can count several hundred. A true daisy or a wild aster has far fewer rays, and each one is broad and clearly separated from its neighbors. Fleabane looks like somebody took a daisy and gave it a fringe. Once you've seen that fringe, you cannot unsee it, and it's the single most reliable field mark you can carry with you. One more feature separates the two most common species. Philadelphia fleabane has leaves that wrap around the stem where they attach, what botanists call clasping. Eastern daisy fleabane's leaves do not clasp. Timing helps too. Fleabanes bloom early and long. They're already going while the asters are still just green leaves, and the asters won't get their turn until the tail end of summer. So if you're looking at a fringed white daisy type flower in May, June, or right now in late July, you are almost certainly looking at a fleabane. And that brings me to the name, because both halves of it are worth unpacking. The genus name, Erigeron, comes from two Greek words, eri, meaning early, and geron, meaning old man. Early old man. And when you see the plant through a full season, that name makes perfect sense. It's one of the earliest of its family to flower, and as soon as those heads finish, they go to seed and turn into little tufts of white down, a soft gray-white fluff. So the plant is simultaneously flowering and going gray. It's blooming early and looking old at the same time. Whoever named it was paying attention. Then there's fleabane. Flea and bane. Bane is an old English word meaning destroyer, or something that drives out. So the name is a claim, and the claim is that this plant gets rid of fleas. And for a very long time, people believed it absolutely. Bundles of it were cut and dried and hung from the rafters of cabins. It was tucked into bedding and stuffed into the straw ticks that people slept on. In an era when a flea infestation wasn't an inconvenience, it was just a fact of daily life. Here's the twist. As far as we can tell, it doesn't work. When people eventually got around to testing the idea properly, fleabane did not deliver on the promise its name makes, and yet the name stuck, and we still use it today, several hundred years after the belief behind it fell apart. But I don't think our ancestors were being foolish, and here's why. Crush a handful of this plant between your palms and take a sniff. There's a genuine aromatic quality there, faintly resinous, slightly sharp, a little like a green herb you can't quite place. That's not your imagination. Plants in this group carry volatile oils, and the dominant compound in some of them is limonene, which is the same aromatic compound that hits you when you scratch the peel of an orange. So people were smelling something real and drawing a reasonable conclusion from it. They were just wrong about what it did. Now, the reputation problem. Why does a native plant get treated like a trespasser? I think it comes down to one thing. Nobody plants it. It shows up. It appears in the gap by the mailbox, in the crack at the edge of the sidewalk, along the fence row, in the bare corner of a yard where a shed used to sit. And because it arrives on its own, and often arrives in numbers, people file it under weeds without a second thought. But fleabane is native to North America. It is not an invasive plant, and what it's actually doing is a job that ecologists have a name for. It's a pioneer species. When ground gets stripped, scraped, flooded, or otherwise beaten up, pioneer species are the first to move in. Their roots hold loose soil in place, they shade the bare ground, they start building organic matter, and they hold the site together long enough for slower, longer-lived plants to establish. Fleabane isn't the problem in a disturbed corner of your yard, it's the repair crew. And while it's doing that, it's feeding things. Those tiny florets sit shallow and open, which makes the nectar accessible to short-tongued insects, the small native bees, the hoverflies, the little wasps and beetles that get almost no attention compared to honeybees, but do an enormous amount of pollination work. Because fleabane blooms early and keeps going for months, it bridges a gap. It's open when the spring flowers have finished and the late summer goldenrod and asters haven't started. If you've ever wondered where the small pollinators go in that mid-season lull, a lot of them are on plants exactly like this one. Pull it out, spray it, or trim it flat, And you're not removing a flower. You're removing a working piece of habitat during the stretch of the year when it's hardest to replace. Now let's get to the part I find genuinely remarkable, which is this plant's place in written history. Indigenous peoples across eastern North America used fleabanes extensively, and we know that because ethnobotanists went out over the last century and a half, sat down with tribal communities, and recorded what they were told. Those records describe Ojibwe use of fleabane flowers steeped into a tea. They describe Cherokee, Catawba, Huma, and Haudenosaunee uses spanning teas, poultices for headaches, washes for irritated skin, and preparations for coughs and colds. I want to frame that properly. These are documented traditions, recorded from the people who held them, a record of what was done and believed, not a modern medical endorsement, and I'm not presenting them as one. Then the story crosses the Atlantic. That fourth species I mentioned, Canada fleabane, made it to Europe in the 17th century and spread with astonishing speed. It's now naturalized across Eurasia and Australia, one of the most widely distributed plants on the planet. And in 19th century America, it got something almost no roadside plant ever gets. Physicians and pharmacists distilled a volatile oil out of the fresh flowering plant. They called it oil of erigeron, oil of fleabane. It was a pale straw-colored liquid with a persistent aromatic odor, and it was recognized in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official reference standard for drugs in this country. A plant out of ditches and neglected fields had a formal entry in the National Drug Book, and it produced one of my favorite small stories in American botany. In the mid-1800s, peppermint growers started complaining that a weed was contaminating their fields and fouling their oil. They called the culprit fireweed. A professor of pharmacy in Philadelphia was suspicious because the plant they described didn't sound like fireweed at all. So he wrote to peppermint farmers around the country and mailed them actual botanical specimens so there could be no confusion. The weed wasn't fireweed. It was Canada fleabane. He published the correction in 1870, and it settled a mix-up that had been muddling both the science and the commerce of essential oils for years. So let's talk about the tea, because that's what brought you here. Traditionally, the parts used are the flower heads and the young, tender leaves gathered while the plant is in bloom. The method is simple. You can use it fresh or dried. Fresh, take a small handful of flower heads and a few young leaves, drop them in a mug, pour boiling water over the top, cover it, and let it steep for 5 to 10 minutes, then strain. To dry it, cut the flowering stems, bundle them loosely, and hang them upside down somewhere shaded with moving air until they're crisp. Then crumble the heads and leaves into a jar and keep them out of the light. What does it actually taste like? Let me be honest with you rather than sell you something. It's a light tea. The color is a pale straw gold. The aroma is hay-like with a faint herbal edge, and people very often reach for the word chamomile, which makes sense because they're relatives. The flavor is mildly grassy and gently bitter, and the finish is where it announces itself. There's an astringency to it, a dryness that pulls at the tongue the way strong black tea does. That astringency is characteristic of this whole group of plants, and it's exactly what 19th century writers described when they tasted the plant itself. Younger flower heads give you a softer, sweeter cup. Older material gets noticeably more bitter. Most people blend it, and a little mint from the same yard smooths it out beautifully. Now, here is the part that matters most, and I'm going to be very direct about it, because I'd rather you trust me than rush outside. Before anything goes in a cup, be certain of your identification. Look for the hairy stem, the alternate toothed leaves, the small half-inch head, and above all that dense fringe of narrow white rays. If you have any doubt at all, don't use it. Second, know your ground. Never gather from a lawn that's been treated with herbicide or pesticide, and skip roadsides and ditches along busy roads where runoff and exhaust residue settle into the soil and the plants growing in it. Third, this is a member of the aster family, which includes ragweed. If you're someone who reacts badly to that family, this is not a plant to experiment with. Fourth, and this one is important, traditional herbal sources are consistent that anyone who is pregnant or trying to conceive should avoid fleabane entirely. That's not a small footnote, it's a firm caution, and I'd extend the same caution to anyone nursing. And to be completely clear, everything I've described about historical medicinal use is history. It's a record of what people believed and practiced, not verified modern medical guidance, and nothing in this video is medical advice. If you take medication or manage a health condition, talk to your doctor before adding any new plant to your routine. I'm sharing this as a naturalist and a historian, not as a physician. So here's where I've landed on this plant. Standing at the edge of my driveway on a hot afternoon in late July. It's native. It's a pioneer that repairs broken ground. It feeds the small pollinators through the hardest stretch of the season. It carries a name built on a belief that turned out to be wrong, which is a wonderfully human thing for a plant to carry. It fed and treated people on this continent for centuries, and for a while it sat in the official drug book of the United States. And you can pick a handful of it, pour hot water over it, and taste something people were tasting here before this country had a name. That's the whole point of what I do. The extraordinary thing is almost never the rare thing you have to travel for. It's the thing at the edge of the driveway that you've walked past 10,000 times. So the next time you're about to trim that ragged corner of the yard flat, take a knee first and look at those tiny fringed white flowers and give them a season. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you like what I do here, please subscribe, give the video a like, and leave me a comment, because I genuinely love hearing what's growing in your part of the country. Tell me which fleabane you've got where you are. And remember, I cover all things nature, from frogs, toads, snakes, and turtles, to insects, spiders, trees, wildflowers, mosses, and fungi. Everything you might run into just outside your own door. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.